All right, I think we're about ready to get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much again for joining us today. My name is Abigail Stowe-Thurston, and I'm a project lead at CRDF Global in the Security Assistance Division. We are very excited for today's panel on disinformation and chemical weapons proliferation. It is my pleasure to introduce Tom Callahan, CRDF Global's Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and Evaluation. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much. Can you read me loud and clear? Great. It is a great pleasure to do a brief introduction and welcome our speakers. Just a couple of housekeeping notes up front. Today's session is on the record and will be recorded. If there are any members of the media who want clarifications or have follow-up questions, please contact the speakers directly, or you can go through Ashley Truxon or Abigail here at CRDF Global. Taking advantage of the virtual format, you may insert questions into the chat. Our colleague Amber will field them and may consolidate those if there are overlapping themes. Our topics today, disinformation and chemical weapons use and proliferation, are really subsets of wider and interlocking concerns. On the chemical proliferation front, we've had a comprehensive international treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, in force since 1997. It's been very useful in solidifying a clear international norm. But over the last several years, we have seen both state and non-state actors conduct chemical weapons attacks. The Assad government and ISIS have both used chemical weapons, including chlorine, sarin, and sulfur mustard against civilian populations in Syria. And in some ways, even more disturbing has been the use of Novichok by Russia, a leading state power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, in targeted attacks against defectors and dissidents. Disinformation enters the equation in observing how state actors have sought to manipulate the reporting of these breaches, interfere with investigations, and deny accountability. In the dystopian novel 1984, George Orwell wrote, "Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense." Disinformation, malinformation, and state-sponsored influence operations are certainly nothing new in the history of geopolitics. What is new, however, is the extraordinary reach that state actors with no self-restraint can attain across borders, getting into the perceptions, fears, and even the minds of citizens of other nation states. Existing international norms to counter WMD proliferation, such as the Chemical Weapons Convention, clearly need ongoing shoring up and renewed commitment. And new international norms around influence operations and disinformation in this supercharged communications and information environment of the 21st century must be developed and adopted. We are honored today to host two speakers uniquely positioned to discuss these issues. Sarah Jacobs Gamberini is a policy fellow at the National Defense University Center for Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction. Her research includes disinformation, influence operations, and information warfare activities with a focus on understanding the intersections of disinformation and WMD. In her recent report on social media weaponization, Ms. Gamberini describes the methods and goals of Russia's influence operations and assesses the implications for targeting matters of public health like COVID-19 and the vaccination debate. At NDU, she teaches a course on WMD and mass media, which provides a baseline understanding of WMD threats with an emphasis on media literacy in a post-truth world. That sounds like something out of Orwell as well, Sarah. Dr. Marc-Michael Blum, a consultant at Blum Scientific, worked in the laboratory of the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, from 2012 to 2019. From July 2017 to September 19, he served as the head of laboratory. His responsibilities, among others, included general guidance for all research activities, the conduct of OPCW's proficiency testing program, the lab's quality systems, the initial planning phase of the new Center for Chemistry and Technology. And in 2018, he was the team leader for the OPCW's missions to Salisbury and Amesbury in the UK, following the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter, Yulia. Both speakers are here today in their personal capacity. Their views do not necessarily reflect those of any organization that they are or have been affiliated with. So on behalf of our CEO and all of us at CRDF Global, welcome Sarah and Dr. Blum, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction. So we'll start this event by having each of our panelists give a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll welcome questions from the audience for a Q&A session. Please, again, submit your questions to the Q&A function using Zoom, and do feel free to send a direct message to our colleague Amber Metalis if you have any questions or technical issues with the Zoom call. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Marc-Michael Blum for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for your kind words and introduction. Also, thank you, Abigail. Good morning to the US East Coast, a good afternoon to Europe, and I've seen we have participants here from Asia and Africa, so a general welcome to today's event also from my side. I want to give a brief introduction to how our perception of chemical warfare has changed over the recent years and what implication that means also with respect to disinformation campaigns. And then Sarah will dig more deeply into that. And this is my only slide here today I'm showing to you. And I know it's an overused internet Twitter meme, but I think it's very illustrative to what we're talking about. If we still talk about chemical warfare in the classical WMD sense, mass destruction, mass effect, we think about large chemical arsenals, about the old way chemical warfare would have happened in case the Cold War would have turned hot. So large arsenals, big armies engaging each other using chemical armaments. This thinking needs to change because what we really experience, you see on the right. We see low-level use by terrorists. You see here on the bottom right some very low-quality sulfur mustard used by ISIS in Syria. They also used it in northern Iraq. You see, again, relatively low-level use in domestic conflict, especially if you look at the number of chemical casualties versus conventional casualties in the Syrian conflict, which is definitely also due to the fact that the world is really watching here. And then you see Alexei Navalny, Sergei Skripal, and Kim Jong-nam all being victims of either a successful poisoning attempt or unsuccessful poisoning attempts using chemical nerve agents. So this is a very big difference between the left and the right. And please take down the slide, thank you. What does this mean? And why is it that way? Because we have the Chemical Weapons Convention in force since the late 1990s, there is an enforced global norm against the use of chemical weapons. And again, I think it's important to point out that the CWC is not an arms control treaty, it's a disarmament treaty. It bans a complete category of weapons of mass destruction. So the big arsenals are gone. The US is about to finish its last destruction activities at 2 destruction sites. I would rather say within the next months, 2023. With that, all declared chemical weapons stockpile are gone, apart from old and abandoned chemical munitions from the First and Second World War. This norm is actively enforced. There's the OPCW as the treaty implementation organization and the chemical weapons watchdog. Still, we see chemical weapons use, but not in the classical mass destruction or mass effect sense. So for example, if we look at the poisoning cases we see with Kim Jong-nam, with Sergei Skripal, his daughter, and other affected casualties in the UK, and with Alexei Navalny, we now face a really big problem. And let me explain this by looking at the Navalny case. So Sergei Navalny, as we all know, was apparently poisoned in his hotel room where a Novichok agent was applied to his underwear. And then he collapsed hours later on a flight back to Moscow. And what saved him was a brave pilot who decided to land in Omsk, and also good immediate medical treatment on site by the first paramedic and doctors treating him. If there would be no diversion of that flight, Mr. Navalny would have probably died on the way to Moscow, and he would have been taken into a hospital, and then probably there would be some toxicological screening on his blood, and people would try to find out what happened. And I think it's probably fair to say that a normal hospital, a normal tox screen would fail to identify a Novichok agent, even though Russia as a country definitely is one of the very few that is able to detect these agents. So the question might be, how many countries in the world are able to take a blood sample of a poisoned person where a non-listed, undeclared Novichok agent was used? I would say we look at 10 countries or less. That means you can go around the world and pretty effectively start poisoning and killing people without people even being aware of what has happened. So the detection of these kinds of attacks is really difficult. Even more difficult is then the attribution of these assassination attempts. And if we now look, this forms a tremendous challenge for the CWC. The CWC was negotiated, it was agreed to deal with the big stockpiles, it was agreed to deal with the big chemical war, and it's very effective. The big arsenals are gone. I think it's safe to say that seeing this kind of big chemical war between major powers these days is rather unlikely. On the other hand, the measures implemented by the CWC are probably not ideal when it comes to low-level use, when it's very easy to hide a few grams of something, while the treaty is made to discover tons of something. And also, and this is a follow-up from the Skripal case, the OPCW now has a mandate to attribute cases in Syria, or if something happens on the territory of a state party. So Russia could ask the OPCW to attribute the Navalny case because it happened on Russian soil. I'm not very optimistic this will happen, but attribution is difficult in a classical sense, but also when you look at chemical samples. And as I said, many countries are just not prepared. There are no laboratory capabilities at all, or they are so rudimentary that these very specific agents will go undetected. And if you have a case like the Navalny case, and we've seen this, and we've also seen it in other cases, because there is this lack, there is time where nobody knows what goes on, it leaves a big void of non-information. And this big void will be filled automatically. And if it's partially by correct information, but probably mostly at the beginning by disinformation and misinformation, people will just start to make up their own truth, and then interested parties will come and feed their own truth into the general public narrative. And this is one of the really big challenges we are facing. And I think there is a major role here for expert voices. And I mean, if you have been following Twitter on cases like chemical weapon use in Syria, on the Skripal or the Navalny case, you've seen a lot of different narratives, a lot of alternatives of what could have happened here. One of the late ones on Navalny is that Germany and the OPCW conspired with each other, that an OPCW team was even in Berlin on the day Navalny was poisoned, and this is due to a date error in a draft report. Of course, that didn't happen, and it can be proved, but of course you generate that narrative. And in the end, so Germany apparently poisoned Mr. Navalny, or it's not really publicly said, but it's implied, implicitly, sometimes explicitly. And the same thing we saw in the Skripal case, where apparently a different agent was found, where they were not poisoned at all. They were poisoned by the British or alternative narratives. And here I think it is important, keep in mind, the OPCW reports primarily to member states. This is the body they are talking to, not the general public so much. And so there are things also the OPCW and other bodies cannot really reveal at a certain point. I mean, especially not if it's an active investigation. So we need people to stand up and provide factual information, scientific and technical background that counters this disinformation narrative. And I think this is a key job for the subject matter experts out there. Because, I mean, search for OPCW or search for chemical weapons on Twitter and see how many of the hits you are getting you would file under misinformation, disinformation, and how many of them you would file under probably trustful sources. There's a major misbalance right now. With that, I will leave it here and hand it over to Sarah. I think she has now a lot to say about the disinformation aspects, and I'm very much looking forward to the question and answers later on. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Blum and Abigail and Tom and CRDF for having me today. I am a policy fellow at the National Defense University Center for the Study of WMD, but my usual government caveat that I am here in my own capacity and not speaking for NDU, DoD, or the US government, and that my remarks are off the record. If we can have our slides up here. So today I will talk a little bit about how and why Russia uses disinformation around weapons of mass destruction, and how the resulting complicated information environment undermines WMD norms. The examples I'll talk about are disinformation and Syrian chemical weapons use, and mis and disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've seen in recent years an uptick of chemical weapon use by both state actors and VEOs, and as a tool of assassination. And there's a growing concern that the global norm against these type of weapons embodied by the Chemical Weapons Convention is eroding, and that the advances in chemical science and technology could lead to new threat possibilities. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are similarly seeing a use of disinformation to sow chaos and confusion around bio. And while COVID-19 is a natural bio outbreak and not WMD, the resulting undermining of norms and institutions, including those of arms control and science, are nonetheless concerning. Slide. For Russia, disinformation is part of a cross-domain strategy, which includes fighting on multiple planes without the distinction of war and peace. And it's variously been referred to as gray zone, hybrid, or asymmetric warfare. This cross-domain warfare includes various malign activities on multiple planes, often below the threshold of armed conflict. And there's lots of examples of how Russia has done this. And because of the nature of this type of warfare, there's likely many more that we're unaware, but just a few examples here, everything from little green men in Crimea, unaffiliated private military groups, cyber attacks, Novichok use. And because of the deniability that Russia has maintained in each of these cases, attribution and proportionality are thrown into question. Russia integrates all military and non-military devices to achieve its strategic goals, and that includes in the information space. In 2019, Russian General Valery Gerasimov gave a speech in which he called information technologies one of the most promising types of weapons, and not just to be used against information infrastructures like we think about for cyber attacks, but against the population of a country, directly influencing the condition of a state's national security. Slide. Russia views the United States, NATO, and the European Union as committed to weakening Russia, eliminating Russia's sphere of influence, and ensuring sustained US Western unipolar dominance. Now, these views predate the information age, but information technologies alarmingly exacerbates all of these threats. A 2013 Russian military journal said, information is now a species of weapon. All forms of information across all platforms are potential sources of power and can be weaponized. Russia believes the West is seeking dominance across all strategic domains and uses all forms of information technology against them. So Russia sees Western dominance manifested socially and culturally. They see persistent Western entertainment and media as overtly anti-Russian messages seeking to replace Russian culture, values, and language. Russia views internet and social media as tools for Western intelligence services to coordinate activists and provocateurs. And militarily, they see US ISR and other information technology systems as networked military capabilities designed to summarily dismantle any opponent slow to adapt. Russia also views itself as behind the West in science and technology. At points, it's reached parity in some defense platforms, but for the most part, it's struggled to keep pace and really relies on WMD for deterrence. On top of all of this, it has demographic and economic challenges. So all of this to say, Russia sees itself on the defensive in this scenario and is in a constant state of besiegement and deficiency. Slide. So how does Russia respond to this? Since the end of the Cold War, Russia has had to be calculating and creative to balance its economic, military, and technological disadvantages to compete with the United States, maximizing less conventional tools of war, including covert operations in the information domain. So it's working to create a Russia-only internet with aspirations of creating a Russian equivalent of China's Great Firewall. Russian news and propaganda is beamed in to counter Western cable news. So for example, state-controlled television network RT and online news aggregators like Sputnik. Additionally, Russia holds Western information operations, military systems at risk, both physically with anti-space capabilities and with cyber attacks. Finally, and importantly for this discussion, trolls and bots as part of a broader disinformation ecosystem. The Russian government's active internet presence pervades the social media landscape using large numbers of Russian web brigades, troll farms, so real people hired to push out a message, and automated bots to disseminate propaganda and flood hashtags. Slide. So we're here to discuss the norm against chemical weapons. In the last decade, we have seen VX use for assassination by North Korea, instances of Novichok use for attempted assassinations, and widespread chemical weapons use against civilians in Syria. This may seem to demonstrate a crumbling of this norm, but the very fact that these countries resorted to elaborate disinformation campaigns to deny, confuse, and deflect blame for these CW uses, in some ways is a demonstration that at least the part of the norm that says this is not a legitimate weapon is still intact. I'm going to talk a little bit about how disinformation complicates all the layered of defenses that we need to deter future use. So there were over 300 instances of chemical weapons use over the last decade, but I want to talk about a single day in April 2018, where there were 2 attacks in Douma, Syria. But the repercussions of the evolving story of this one day lasted years. The attacks killed 50, wounded hundreds, and there were many witness accounts and videos. First responders and people on the ground were familiar with CW at that point, and so they took diligent notes for future use in prosecution if and when that was needed. And they knew that the perpetrators would deny the events and change the narrative. The international response to the attack was swift, with airstrikes and the convening of the OPCW and an OPCW investigation. Disinformation about the attack, both who did it and what was used, was immediate from both Russia and Syria. They utilized the full disinformation ecosystem using bots, trolls, state-run media, and official accounts, and accounts of similar-minded state actors to amplify messages, lending legitimacy or at least plausibility to their narratives. So this complicated interplay of state-sponsored content and trolls and bots moving that information both complicates attribution and lends credibility to the narrative that's now being shared by multiple mouthpieces. The false flag narrative serves to divert blame, deny it's them, place blame on someone else, and even claim that there was staged evidence. They also demonize the Syrian civil defense, who were on the ground to respond to the attack. The Syrian civil defense is also known as the White Helmets, and they were recast in the disinformation narrative as terrorists. Now, by conflating white helmets and terrorist groups, it allows the white helmets to be targeted. It shifts the blame and it creates confusion. Meanwhile, there are multiple official organizations and media trying to find the truth about these attacks. There's the official OPCW panel, mainstream media, and open source analysis. Bellingcat, the independent investigative journalism outfit and fact-checking organization, came out with a report within days of the attack. New York Times had an interactive report debunking theories about the false flag claims, and the OPCW official report pointed to an unlikely agent, nerve agent, but that chlorine was used, and also debunked the false flag theory about a lab in Eastern Ghouta run by extremists. We also have to contend with competing experts. Whistleblowers from within the OPCW came forward and called into question the legitimacy of the OPCW report. And because of the open platform that is the internet, to put out more information, there are experts or those claiming to be experts putting out their own version of the story, or as Dr. Blum calls, the void of non-information. And this muddies the information sphere and dilutes official reporting. Now, because of something like chemical weapons being so complicated, the level of expertise needed to show good science from bad science is beyond the reasonable informed consumer. So this is a huge problem when we can't discern and disaggregate all the information. The average person will turn to their own bias, and lies that already match your sympathies or previously known information are just accepted. So this demonstrates the massive task of official organizations and journalists to disprove theories and prove a negative, and then to be believed. Whack-a-mole is not a useful approach in debunking disinformation, but sometimes it's that good first step to regaining control of the narrative. The intention of the disinformation was clear: deny events, misidentify victims, draw into question whether sarin was indeed present, discredit and falsify motives, and elevate alternative authorities, confuse and deflect. Doing this seeks to muddle attribution, make sure non-compliance cannot be definitively determined, and prevent or discredit outside intervention. All of this is dangerous to the norm against chemical weapons and diminishes trust in processes and undermines the effectiveness of institutions, and ultimately can lead to the broader problem of CW proliferation, use, and regulation when attribution and response are hampered by this confused messaging. Slide. So now we're here to talk about disinformation and chemical weapons, but I think there are some relevant lessons to be gleaned from the state-sponsored disinformation during the COVID pandemic, including claims that it was a bioweapon, and this disinformation is being used to undermine Western and democratic institutions. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about COVID disinformation. A month before the global coronavirus outbreak was officially declared a pandemic, the WHO Director General acknowledged, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads fast and more easily than this virus, and it's just as dangerous. So in this post-truth world that has normalized anti-science and anti-vaccine sentiment, the public health crisis of COVID-19 has been characterized by the spread of inadvertent misinformation and malicious and intentional disinformation. Countries have manipulated the information environment in an attempt to win the pandemic by framing themselves as responsible international actors and recasting the United States and its allies as the villain in the story. Russia, China, and Iran have made the accusation that the coronavirus was created by the United States. Conspiracy theories include that it's a US manufactured biological weapon targeting Iran, or that the United States is weaponizing the crisis to benefit its pharmaceutical industry, or that it was brought to Wuhan by US service members. Increasingly, we are seeing vaccine nationalism, with Russia, amplified by China and Iran, spreading harmful disinformation about the American-made COVID vaccines to increase their share of the market for their own Sputnik, or in the case of China, Sinovac vaccine, and gain power in the global fight to end the pandemic. And much like mask diplomacy early in the pandemic, where countries sought to provide masks and ventilators to help with the pandemic, but also to gain diplomatic points, we're now in a new phase of the pandemic of propaganda and messaging and what I call vaccine diplomacy. But the stakes are much higher. Convincing the world to take a certain COVID vaccine could mean huge financial or diplomatic opportunities in corners of the world that Russia would like to establish. And destroying faith in American and British-made vaccines can have significant health effects for individuals and all of society if we can't get the pandemic under control with broad vaccine acceptance. Russia has conducted targeted campaigns in countries it hopes will adopt the Sputnik vaccine, including Mexico, countries in Eastern Europe, and Central and West Africa, using its RT affiliates in the region to spread disinformation and malinformation, which is often using real facts, but out of context. For example, amplifying the story about the deaths during the Pfizer trial without the proper context. And this campaign started in August 2020 when Russia first approved and announced its Sputnik vaccine using the same methodology we come to expect. RT and other state mouthpieces put out information along the theme that Russia's Sputnik vaccine is better than its American competitors, and then is retweeted by other authorities, including Russian embassies in these countries. And this manipulated information proliferates and lends new legitimacy to the narrative. And then there's the broader strategic goals. These efforts are part of an ongoing information warfare campaign by the Kremlin that has included deploying contradictory narratives about the United States and its allies with the broader goals of undermining democracy, eliminating the US influence in its near abroad, and sowing doubt and discord in societies and undermining trust in institutions of science and government. And while Russia, China, and Iran are seeking to capitalize on this current crisis, their tactics are not new. Rather, America's adversaries are borrowing from an influence operations playbook first developed during the Cold War. What's new is that these disinformation efforts now benefit from the speed and reach of modern media to rapidly shape and influence both opinions and actions across the globe. So we're seeing history repeat itself a little here with new tools and new amplifying partnerships among Russia, China, and Iran. Slide. So what does this all say about the norm against biological and chemical weapons? Disinformation muddies our ability to definitively attribute chemical weapons use to actors who are denying it and providing alternative narratives. And this leads to a failure to hold the perpetrators responsible and opens the door for future use. Russia and its allies have a cheap and effective tool to undermine norms of liberal institutions and democratic systems, and it's not going to stop. The confusion, undermining of norms, and weakened institutions that come from their disinformation further complicates and enables Russia's use of banned weapons. An all of society layered response is the only solution to help attribute and counter this disinformation and chemical weapons use. That's it for me. I'm really looking forward to your questions and further discussion today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah and Marc-Michael. All right. So I see we already have several questions in the chat. Again, if you have a question for either or both of our panelists, please do add them to the Q&A function of Zoom so that we can track them and make sure that we're asking them. We may, collate some questions and add them, or kind of lump them together if they're on similar topics that we're not too repetitive. But first, I'd like to ask both of our panelists a question. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the idea of continuity and change with regards to both of these problems, the chemical weapon threat and threats posed by disinformation. This was a theme that came up in both of your presentations. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about how these challenges are converging in new ways and whether there are existing tools from previous iterations of these problems that could be updated to address them today. So Marc-Michael, why don't you start with that question if that's okay?
Sorry, I had a really brief outage here of audio. I think I missed the first 10 seconds of the question.
I'm very sorry. So this question is really about continuity and change, and that has to do with the chemical weapons threat and the disinformation threat. So I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that from your perspective, and especially about whether there are existing tools from, even from the Cold War that could be updated to address these problems today in their current form.
All right, thank you. So in principle, if you look at the Chemical Weapons Convention, which took many, many years to negotiate and agree on, and in general, these treaties have a tendency to be like a very, very rusty battleship. It's very tough to get them moving when it comes to change. So, but there was change. After the Skripal incident, the state parties agreed on listing new nerve agents from the so-called Novichok family. in Schedule 1 of the Chemical Weapons Convention. This Schedule 1 basically means that there are very far-reaching prohibitions on the production and use of these chemicals. This was the first time this annex on chemicals in the convention was amended. So you see already that with more than 20 years of the CWC being in force, and then it's the first change that there's a very strong structural conservatism in these treaties, but they can move. That's one thing. Also, we've seen that when we had the chemical weapon use in Ghouta in Syria, the first really large-scale chemical attack that was also investigated by the UN with the help of WHO and OPCW personnel, that then, with the pressure of Russia and the United States, Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, but because there was ongoing conflict in that country, all these normal measures that would actually happen for declaration of stockpiles and facilities, the destruction, all this would not have worked. And there again, it showed that there was flexibility in addressing this by putting into effect these special missions, the fact-finding missions, the FFMs, the Declaration Assessment Team, the DAT, or there was a special mandate by the OPCW policy-making organs to tackle the specific problem of disarming a country of its chemical stockpile with an ongoing domestic conflict on a very big scale. So there are possibilities I would say if there is political willingness to move in a certain direction, then it's possible. On the other hand, given also people who have been following business at the OPCW and the recent cases know that there's a very big controversy between the US, other Western countries, Russia, China on the other hand, and some other like-minded countries, that this effectively blocks a lot of other business that could potentially be agreed on. So that there is no big window of opportunity here for making big changes. There are still possibilities to do certain things for even on a not directly related matter. For years, the OPCW was running a Twitter account on science and technology, trying to get new technology developments out there related to chemical weapons. Normally that means to chemical defense and countermeasures, just trying to get a voice out there. I think that was really helpful. Also, there is still communication with the public. There is a question in the Q&A on that, like what OPCW is doing to the public. I think we should come back to that because that's a really interesting and very problematic question. But there are possibilities, and calling non-compliance or misbehavior out, pointing the finger at a wrongdoer, I think is totally right. And that has been done during the Cold War as well, and it has been done under treaty regimes. Still, I think that the general norm is still very much intact. Even if there would be no CWC, my prediction would be that chemical weapons use on domestic conflict, for assassination attempts, everything, this kind of modern chemical weapons use we see, which we would see much more of that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Sarah, do you have anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said in my presentation, what we're seeing today in terms of what Russia's overall goals are with their disinformation is not dissimilar from what we saw during the Cold War with their active measures. So we really do have an understanding of what they're trying to accomplish here. But what's really changed are the algorithms and technological ability to really reach many people very quickly and then allow that to proliferate and then become almost grassroots in the way that it's spread, and it's harder to trace back. So the technological aspects have changed, but also our society has changed quite a bit. Even from the 2016 election where Russia interfered compared to the more recent 2020 election, in 2016, Russia kind of had to come up with new narratives and put them out there on their different mouthpieces. What we saw in 2020 was that they didn't have to do that. They just had to amplify our more divisive narratives that were already within our society. And so, societally, we have that problem. Technologically, in terms of the algorithms and which people actually see the harmful narratives, I think that those are two areas that we really need to tackle. But because disinformation is such an all of society threat, there are going to be a lot of different tools that need to happen, and they're not always going to be the same based on who's employing them. So obviously the government is going to have its role of calling out these actors when they do this. And even if we don't have a complete picture, that we can attribute these things to them, if we know that it's true, we should call them out publicly. How they're getting away with chemical weapons use and their disinformation is very similar, and we have to call them out on it. So that's really important. And then also partnering with our allies on this. This is something that it's impacting all of us. So partnering closely within NATO. But because the Department of Education and the Department of Defense and Department of State all have their role in tackling disinformation, they need to make sure that this is part of their mission statement to do their part to counter it, and it won't always be the same. So I think it's really important to understand that an all of society problem like disinformation is going to have an all of society solution, and it's going to be a little bit varied based on who we're talking about.
Thank you very much. So I have a question, and it's really related to one of the questions from the audience that's come into our Q&A box. Sarah, a large part of your presentation was about the norm against using chemical weapons, and you argued that the international responses to these instances of chemical weapons use that you discussed demonstrates that even though there are challenges, the norm is pretty strong. What signs would alert you that the norm against chemical weapons use is really beginning to erode? What are the alarm bells that are ringing when we know we're really in trouble? Related to that, can authoritarian influence operations related to CBRN and WMD be interpreted as a sign that certain states are moving away from the norm already? Or do you really think we're still in an okay place at this point?
Right. So obviously we've seen chemical weapons use in recent years, and this is something that we should be worried about and try to be able to pinpoint and deter. But the fact that these countries are still denying that they're doing it at least gives me to think that they don't think that this is a weapon that should be used or should be used publicly. And so I think that the big change is going to be when we see them doing this blatantly. Now, we're seeing that with Novichok use to some extent. Novichok is clearly a Russian agent, and so their use of that does flaunt the norm quite a bit. But they're still going about and claiming that the United States and Britain and Germany are creating Novichoks and planting the blame on Russia. So I feel like that there's at least that. I mean, then we need to tackle the disinformation associated with chemical weapons use and be able to call them out and attribute. And so the muddled information sphere that we're seeing with their denial is a huge problem, and therefore it really does hurt, it does harm the norm. So we need to be very aware of that. But as long as they're keeping on denying it, I do think that they see that the Chemical Weapons Convention has almost all the countries as signatories. And so, coming together and their worry about how they're being viewed on the world stage still works. I think that once we get to that point where Russia or Syria or another country is doing it a little bit more blatantly, will be a big problem there. But the tools of the CWC and really strengthening that as our way of countering and deterring, I think will be very important, and not coming up with parallel ways of countering this, really strengthening the OPCW. And as Dr. Blum mentioned, we've done this in recent years in terms of their ability to attribute and everything else. So I feel like working within the CWC and the structures that already exist will be a big help there.
Excellent. Dr. Blum, this next question I'd like to direct to you. Confidentiality is essential to many of the OPCW's activities. To what extent do you think that ties the organization's hands in countering disinformation? And do you see any paths forward? What can we do about this?
Thank you. As I said in my introductory remarks, I think it's really important to keep in mind who the OPCW Technical Secretariat, the TS, reports to. And that's the member states and the policy-making organs of the OPCW. It primarily reports to the state parties, because that's the 190 plus bosses the OPCW DG has, and who basically agree on the mandates, on the money, on how this whole operation is conducted. So informing the general public, and OPCW still does that, is still an important part of its work, but it's not the primary focus here. The primary focus will always be communication with the other state parties. And due to the kind of work the OPCW does, of course, confidentiality is essential. For example, all the declaration informations are confidential from every state. That includes the Syrian declaration, but that also includes declarations of any other state party. And this will remain so because otherwise, this will of course affect trust into the treaty and into the organization. So this cannot really be changed fundamentally. Still, you could debate whether the OPCW should say more to the public, and here this is really my very personal view. This you can probably really argue it from both sides. You can say you put more out, which means there's probably more that could be attacked or could be made subject to disinformation campaigns. Still, if you don't say anything, that is probably the same thing. It's just different. So you probably have to choose between two probably non-ideal solutions when it comes to OPCW's reaction to this. But what will remain, and that is simply the fact that the OPCW cannot freely talk about these matters in detail. But I mean, also think about that police and investigators or in criminal matters can't do that. And also keep in mind that the missions the OPCW conducted in the United Kingdom and in Germany, so Skripal and Navalny, were technical assistance visits on request of two state parties, UK and Germany. And with these kind of missions, the requesting state parties are very much in the driver's seat what kind of information is revealed in the end.
I have a bit of a follow-up question for you. You spoke a little bit about the OPCW's Twitter account and the role that plays in enhancing awareness. Are there other steps that international organizations, including the OPCW, can take or are already taking to fight state-sponsored disinformation and misinformation campaigns?
Well, the OPCW does its, and they're really doing a good job here, I think. I mean, about having an open house if there's no COVID pandemic, stopping that. From my time at the laboratory, if I really should recount the number of visitors group we have shown through the laboratory, numerous. It is pretty clear that people come and you are able to show them what you do. And this is not the kind of ultra secret place that nobody will see. Of course, registered visitors group, but you show it to diplomats, you show it to others. That is, of course, key, but probably not that visible. I think that the general open day is more visible, but was, of course, now severely hampered due to the COVID pandemic. Of course, this kind of outreach activities need to continue, and that plays an important role. Also, there is the advisory board on education and outreach. So there is, just like the scientific advisory board, a second advisory board on outreach and education activities, reporting to the DG. And you can look up who's on that panel on the OPCW website. It's also an important body and relatively new. The SAB is there for a long time. The ABEO, as it's called, is a bit newer, but that's again an important thing. And for example, with the help of academics and academic institutions, they developed the Hague Ethical Guidelines for Responsible Scientific Conduct in the chemical science. So there is quite a bit going on. Again, it's a hard uphill battle because the visibility of these activities are still relatively limited, and it's probably more about being more loud about them.
And if I can just add there, Abigail, this idea of putting out more information and amplifying experts is so important. And it kind of goes back to what Dr. Blum was talking about earlier with this void of non-information. It's so important to be able to amplify those voices and work with the social media companies to be able to, for example, with COVID-19, make sure that the voices that are really backed by science are put in front of the right people who need to hear it, and that misinformation, intentional disinformation is taken down really quickly. With misinformation, especially when people are just sharing information that they, or even asking the question about, something that they want to know about COVID-19, but the answer could harm the narrative about either the vaccine or our understanding of the virus, we need to kind of work with the tools that are being used against the narrative. You know, it's about micro-influencers and understanding who holds that trust. And so making sure that those people who are experts and true scientists can be amplified through the algorithm and put in front of the right people is so incredibly important. And then just kind of amplifying what Dr. Blum said earlier, this balancing act that official organizations have for, especially early in either the pandemic for that example, or Syrian chemical weapons, or even Novichok, when there's not a huge understanding of the situation, but you can't allow that void to be filled, because it will be, that vacuum will be filled by other narratives and false information. And so putting out incremental information that is consistent and based on science is so important. But it also leaves this huge problem of official organizations and even mainstream media having to be without reproach. They can't make a mistake, because as soon as they do, that trust can be lost. So it's a huge balancing act. And I think that just putting out consistent messaging, even for the small information that you do have, but it really comes back to a problem of, as a society, that we need to understand the process of science. So in terms of understanding a chemical weapons attack, for example, more facts can lend themselves to a better understanding of the process of science. And so that's not changing the narrative necessarily. And so I think that we need to do a better job of media literacy to make sure that people understand that, science is not a fact, it is a process built on facts. And that we need to be doing a better job as all of society to really gain that media literacy and digital literacy so that we can be better consumers of the information, especially when we're talking about very technical things like chemical weapons or a COVID-19 pandemic.
That's actually a really great segue to my next question. You talked a lot about how we need a multi-layered approach to countering disinformation. It's a whole of society problem, and so we need a whole of society solution. Could you talk a bit more about what the components of those kinds of solutions might look like?
Absolutely. So it's interesting when you're thinking about how do you counter disinformation and how you counter something like a chemical or a biological weapon. Well, they're actually fairly similar in that you're not going to use in kind. You're not going to counter disinformation with disinformation. You're not going to counter a chemical weapon with a chemical weapon. And so thinking about the defense in depth and the different layered approaches that you can put together, whether that's solid messaging, attribution, things of this nature, all of these things need to be layered together. But it kind of also goes back to what I was talking about with the whole of society approach to this. Everybody is going to have their role in countering disinformation and bolstering their defenses to being a target for disinformation. And so just some examples of that we've seen as successes. Social media hasn't done nearly enough to this point to be able to really defend against disinformation. And in many ways, they're part of the problem. But an example, Twitter alerting you to possibly false information. Certainly, we see that with COVID-19. Anytime you type vaccine, you're going to get an alert to say, hi, actually, would you like to go to an official source here and find this information for yourself? So that's something. And also flagging when information is coming from a foreign source, for example. But what we're also finding is that our adversaries are really agile and they'll come up all the time. Something that we found recently is that Russia is coming up with new media organizations all the time. And we know that they're connected to their different intelligence wings, but that takes a little bit of time. And Twitter and Facebook and Instagram aren't necessarily going to be able to move as quickly as our adversaries in flagging that this is, possibly something from a foreign source. So I think remaining agile, integrating technologies, including AI, to our own benefit to make sure that we can stay on top of what is an evolving problem. The fact is, disinformation is really inexpensive, and even if they're marginally successful, they've done a lot for their cause. So we're not going to solve this completely, and that's why that layered defense is going to be so important, that we can at least make ourselves resilient as a society. And again, I can't drive this home enough. Media literacy and digital literacy on behalf of every single one of us as a society, to be able to notice when something is, possibly coming from a bot or a troll, and just trying to drive more debate and more division in our society. I think that that's really on every one of us to make sure that we're doing the right things there.
Thank you so much for that. I think a lot of us are familiar with disinformation that's about much less technical topics like elections and social issues. Marc-Michael, I wonder if you could speak about some of the particular considerations that we need to be making when we're thinking about countering disinformation about very technical topics like chemical weapons.
I think if you look around and you look at what kind of issues have been attacked or have not been attacked, actual laboratory findings, so which chemicals have popped up in a certain analysis, have, with one exception, never been challenged. And that one instant happened during the Skripal mission, where the Russian foreign minister said that a certain OPCW certified laboratory in a certain country, so the Spiez lab in Switzerland, was involved, and that they found a different agent. So, and the OPCW Director General at that time took a very clear stance against this. There was an EC meeting. The report is on the internet, clearly saying two things. First, the OPCW does not reveal the identity of the laboratories carrying out the mission. I think that is absolutely right, because otherwise you probably would have press camping outside those places. There might be active measures against the laboratory. There might be intimidation against its scientists. So these labs must be able to conduct their scientific work in peace and quiet. The other thing was that the DG back then made very clear that no other agent was found. And he also explained a possibility why the claim of another agent was made. So that was important, but otherwise laboratory findings are really challenged for simple reasons. It's a complicated matter. Attacking complicated technical matters is rare because most of the people don't understand and go in depth with the technical understanding here. So you would rather attack more simple issues. Still, the work that is done in this field, when you do analysis, when you try to do attribution and all these things, it is complicated. And I think it's also very important to point out that it's complicated and there are no easy answers. And I think, so for example, what I like to do is sometimes to simply point people to an existing poster or a scientific publication, which might be complicated, but where I say, look here, it's not me, it's other people. It's a peer-reviewed science publication, and it lists all the different kind of, for example, bioanalytical methods to determine if somebody was poisoned by a nerve agent. I think that is helpful, but of course, again, it's limited. And there are, of course, more limits. I'm a former employee of the OPCW. That means that for me, that I still have a secrecy agreement in place, and the stuff, for example, from the Skripal mission that is out there on the internet and in reports, well, that I can talk about, but that's it. And otherwise I can't. And I think it's also important that it stays that way, because you get insight into certain matters and documents which are not freely distributable. So yes, that is something you have to honor, but also it means that you have to place, I won't call it self-censorship, I don't do that, but it puts you on a way where you are definitely probably less outspoken than you would be otherwise. That might still be a little bit of a problem there.
And I think that the nature, yeah, I think that just the nature of the technical, just how technical, understanding chemical weapons is actually makes it the perfect target for disinformation, because the average consumer of information is only going to trust sources that they already have trust in. They're not going to be able to make these decisions for themselves if they don't have deep information about, the chemical processes themselves. And so at a certain point, they have to, understand which sources are their trusted sources. And what we saw, at least from the Syrian chemical weapons, is that a lot of these narratives were being picked up by fringe organizations, whether they had a common anti-American or anti-UN or even some Assad sympathizers. And then it's amazing how quickly that can go into those communities and people who already believe what is, being espoused by those other organizations. And then it pushes it into the mainstream based on, who has picked it up. And so this perpetual he said, she said narrative ends up canceling each other out, and people are more likely to go to the people that they already trust. And that's when our institutions really lose faith and credibility. So it's a huge problem when we're talking about something like an arms control norm, when everything is gray and then nothing is black and white, when it should be with something as simple as, science and the chemical processes themselves. So, this is a huge problem that we see, and that is just endemic in our population at this moment, and not knowing who to trust when there's so much information out there, and especially on things that are such technical areas like this.
If possible, just a very brief example, that has been discussed widely on Twitter. It's something, and both for Skripal and Navalny, if they would both have been exposed to a Novichok, which we all know is far more lethal than VX, where is that written? They would be dead. This is basically one of the narratives that has been transported, that, look, if this really was Novichok, they must be dead by now. And then you have to go ahead and say, no, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on dose, it depends on route of exposure, it depends on medical treatment received, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, you can survive nerve agent exposure. Definitely you can. If the dose is low enough, if the kind of route of exposure is in a special way, if you've received intensive care early enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, this is very easy, and this is easy to understand. You know, people here, these are the most deadliest molecules in the world. So if you're exposed to them, you must be dead. Yes and no. What also doesn't help, for example, in a lot of even official publications, you see, for example, for the chemical nerve agent VX, a coin with a tiny, tiny droplet on it, 10 milligrams, and people say, this will kill you. Well, true, 10 milligram is about the lethal dose for an adult human. But on the other hand, you still have to get those 10 milligrams into the body. And there is a reason why on the military battlefield, these agents would have been used not in milligram scale, but in ton scale, because most of it would even not come to the subject it wants to affect or kill. So there it gets complicated. And I think this is also where you just have to start explaining and continue explaining.
And the United Kingdom did a really great job of this in the aftermath of Novichok disinformation, because there were so many competing narratives coming out and evolving all the time. But they came together and put out a consistent science-based message, and that really helped reveal some of the lies and inconsistencies of all of the what if, but what about this, and all the whataboutism. So that consistent science-based narrative throughout really helped debunk some of that. I think there are a lot of lessons can be learned about the communications that came out from all of these different parts of the UK government, but they came out from one mouthpiece with one kind of goal. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the way that they did that.
So if you don't mind me putting you on the spot a little bit, would you mind sharing a bit more about those lessons learned? I think that's definitely kind of a key objective of this event, is to think through how to better organize our own responses or potential responses. And that's a great case study.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I said in the U.S. government, I know how many different mouthpieces, would be coming to bear if, a Novichok instance were to happen inside the U.S. government. And so just thinking through who are all the players that we need to make sure are coordinating, and thinking through now, if that were to happen, how are we going to make sure that we're all on the same page to be able to put out that consistent message that isn't going to contradict from one part of the government to the other, but then also not leave that void of information. And I think that that's a real challenge, and I can kind of foresee that that might be something that we would have to contend with if we ever were in that kind of situation, making sure that some information is put out so that there's not this vacuum of what ifs filling social media and wondering, and putting out false information, or even just speculation, which can be just as dangerous. So I think that, looking at the case study of the United Kingdom and how they really came together, they had a hub for information, for sharing information, and were very clear, okay, this is the information that we're ready to share with the public, and making sure that new information was being shared as it was known, so that there wasn't that void.
Excellent, thank you. Sarah, this is another question for you. I wonder how much value there is in naming and shaming Russian disinformation. When we see those flags on Twitter, this is a state-affiliated media organ, or whatever it is, versus what is the value of addressing disinformation via diplomacy with Russian officials? Do you know if that's something that's been tried before? Does it just not work? Is it met with even more disinformation? What do you think?
A couple things on this. I definitely think that calling out bad actors, even despite their denial, is crucially important. I mean, they're getting away with this. We need to make sure that we're doing this in a public stage and making sure that we know, making sure that they know we know that this is happening, and this is not just for Russia, but for China as well. On the other hand, when you think about areas where you want to have some commonality, think for arms control, future arms control with Russia and everything, I'm so concerned about the level of trust that we have in our society, but also with each other. And the idea of maybe coming to the negotiating table with somebody that you can't trust is really challenging as we kind of think through strategic stability talks with Russia. But I also really believe that disinformation can be countered at the very, very lowest level, and that's at the human level. And so I think that people maybe have trust in individuals. They don't have trust in institutions. They may have trust with the person across the table from them, but not necessarily country to country. So I think that identifying those lowest levels of trust, that we can find some commonality, I think that that's a really great place to start building that trust back at a bigger level. So with anything, I think that everything here is so hyper local. And I mean local at the, even social media level, the people that you interact with the most. Those are the people who that trust exists already. They can help, reveal and debunk some of the bad information out there. Same with our countries. I think that there might be a really good opportunity for individuals to really engage with one another and start building that trust back. I'm hopeful, at least.
Great, thank you. This is a question that's a bit more in the weeds. Dr. Blum, this is for you. A pattern has emerged at the OPCW where certain countries abstain in crucial votes in areas where there's disagreement between Russia and the Western states. And one example of this was the suspension of Syria at CSP in the spring. Is this driven by the fact that Russian disinformation resonates with these countries? Have you seen any evidence to that effect? Or are these more driven by internal political considerations? And Sarah, I'll turn it to you afterwards if you would like to comment as well.
All right, thank you. No, I have no signs pointing in either direction. So this is more speculation on my side that I think the real driving factor for a lot of abstentions you see, like in a CSP, is that there are countries, especially smaller ones, if they are not closely aligned to either the US or China or Russia, who just like to stay out of what they perceive as a battle of the big fishes in the lake, where you try to just say, yeah, is it really worth here casting our vote? Well, they should. I mean, they are part of the Chemical Weapons Convention, so it's also up to them to uphold the norm and not just to some players, some big players. But I think there is sometimes very little appetite in governments then instructing their diplomats in The Hague to take sides. And by saying that, I saw a question was in the Q&A about alleged chemical weapons use in Darfur, and that the OPCW didn't initiate any further investigations. That is true. But if other neighbors of the area would have wanted to initiate something, there are measures in the CWC to do that. And any member state can raise issues to another member state. Well, in that case, we have to say South Sudan is not a member state, but then Sudan is. And it's not only that everybody has to wait for action by the big players, but if you have regional concerns of non-compliance, these can also, of course, be raised by any member state, regardless of size.
Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Not particularly, but just to also say that, a challenge with something like the Chemical Weapons Convention that is a political agreement, they're working to make sure that the OPCW has more opportunities to actually follow up and attribute and everything else. But for the example of Novichok against Alexei Navalny, if Russia doesn't allow the investigation within their own territory, and then it has to happen elsewhere. There is some weaknesses there. I don't know if Dr. Blum has anything else to offer on that, but it's just, it's one of these things where we can continue trying to make sure that the OPCW has all of the tools to do what it needs to deter future use. But if not everyone is playing by the same rules, that's a challenge in itself.
If I may say a word on deter future use, I mean, of course, ideally it would be nice if people would just abstain from using these things, and then we don't have to deal with disinformation campaigns and everything. In my opinion, a major deterring factor here is that if you have to raise the risk of getting caught, and that means, as I said in my introductory remarks, there are not many countries that would be able to detect a undeclared Novichok not in any analytical database from a biomedical sample and then come up with the structure of the used agent. So on the science side and on the laboratory side, a lot more can be done, both for biomedical and for environmental samples, because that means the risk for a perpetrator that his work is immediately linked to a nerve agent, and that might also raise the chances of then going in for investigators and finding and answering the question who it was is much higher. So this is definitely something that should go on. And I mean, the OPCW aims at enlarging the number of OPCW certified labs, which is, of course, nothing that happens overnight, because if you go from 0 to a certified lab, that is a multi-year effort, costing money, dedication, also political will in the end. And you have to answer the question to yourself, if you ask for money in the government system, do we really need that? And quite often, I think, especially in smaller countries, the answer is we don't think so. And maybe they have to rethink that. The other thing is, by using science, there was the joint investigative mechanism of the OPCW and the UN operating under its own mandate to look into certain uses of chemical weapons in Syria, for example, the chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun. And so it was not the OPCW, even though OPCW was involved, but it was the joint investigative mechanism. And they came up with a report saying, look, in the sarin or the degradation products we find here, we see marker chemicals that link this to the stockpile of the Syrian Arab Republic. Well, that report was not noted by the Security Council due to a veto, but on the other hand, after that, we've never seen the use of sarin and other nerve agents in Syria. It probably effectively rendered whatever was left useless. And I think these technical means have real value and can deter use. And this is something probably also aiming at other countries outside also the traditional alliance systems like NATO, or political alliances like the European Union should look at, also so that they don't fail prey and victim to such attacks.
Excellent. We have time for just one more question. This is from Tom Callahan, who introduced you both at the beginning of this event. Do you have any thoughts on lessons learned from the CWC and the OPCW for the less developed and institutionalized biological weapons convention? And particularly in light of the democratization of technologies like synthetic biological engineering, and perhaps the ability to use very small targeted amounts of a bioweapon in the same way that we've seen targeted chemical attacks.
I'll start with this one. Well, of course, the BWC lacks the verification mechanism the CWC has, and I think it was definitely one of the lessons learned from the BWC and also of non-compliance issues by the Soviet Union, that a verification mechanism was required to make the CWC effective. That leaves the question how to tackle issues. How do we find out about a potential biological weapon use, and how can we differentiate that from a outbreak of natural origin? What exists in parallel is the United Nations Secretary General mechanism for the investigation of WMD use, which is based on some resolutions that came into effect related to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, still exists. Says that the investigations of chemical weapons is now with the OPCW for its member states. The first Syria mission with the UN, GOTA, that was under the UN SGM back then, because Syria was not a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. But there is a number of laboratories that aim in harmonizing their procedures, their reporting formats, and come to something like the OPCW network of designated laboratories. So even though this is not an integral part of the VWC, where I think any kind of verification to get that officially into the treaty or on the side of the treaty is still difficult, but you have a different mechanism with labs that you can actually activate in case something happens.
And I am certainly not an expert on the Biological Weapons Convention, but I will say that in light of COVID-19 and in light of, as Tom mentions, the democratization of technologies in terms of synthetic bio, I think we are going to see this resurgence of a call for better norms to really make sure that we are prepared for any future intentional, natural, or lab leak incident. But what I will say is that the BWC is really well respected and has buy-in globally. And so making sure that we work within the structures that already do exist and building from there, and not trying to create parallel structures and having to deal with getting global buy-in on a new system is best to work within what already exists, which is the BWC. And then my colleagues at the WMD Center, including Amanda Moody, have done great work on this in terms of making sure that we are prepared for all of these areas, that we should make sure that we are prepared for any future intentional lab leak or natural instance, and that we shouldn't prioritize one over the other, because they're all going to be important in terms of making sure that we can be ready for any of these kind of bio incidents in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our speakers, Sarah and Marc-Michael, and thank you also to our excellent audience. We really appreciated your questions. This was such a participatory group, and we really appreciate that. Thank you again for joining this event this morning. We look forward to seeing you again soon. CRDF Global is hosting several of these kind of open to the public events, so please follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to get notified about those. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.